This is a sensation, an attempt on Shoigu's life. They tried to blow him up. The FSB showed exclusive footage of the arrest of the alleged participants in the terrorist attack. Another one
will succeed. What's your name? What's your name? And your first name, last name, and patronymic?
But this story isn't about saving Shoigu. It looks like the Kremlin is preparing for his future elimination. Who benefits from removing Shoigu, and why now? Let's break it down. A sensation, friends. On November 18th, an attempt on Shoigu's life. They were preparing to blow him up. The FSB announced that it had prevented an assassination attempt on Sergei Shoigu, the former Minister of Defense. Allegedly, drug-addicted Russians, migrants from Central Asia, and men from Kiev were preparing to blow him up at the Troyekurovskoye cemetery. But this story isn't about saving Shoigu. It looks like the Kremlin is preparing for his future elimination. Who benefits from removing Shoigu, and why now? We're breaking all this down with Vladimir Osechkin. Watch this. Today in Russia, it's the assassination attempt of the century. They were preparing to blow up Shoigu, a man who is called the second most powerful person after Putin in Russia, the former Minister of Defense, the country's chief corrupt official. The FSB announced that it had prevented a terrorist attack. Yes, it's all very serious. An explosion, a cemetery, an anniversary, a Ukrainian plot, migrants, drugs, all at once. Give this video a like and let us know what you think in the comments. Let's get started. So where and when was it all supposed to happen? According to the FSB, the assassination attempt was planned for November 12th at the Troyekurovskoye cemetery in Moscow, on the anniversary of the death of Shoigu's mother, Alexandra. That is exactly where, according to the intelligence agency's version, Shoigu was supposed to arrive. What does the FSB claim? An explosive device was allegedly planted near the grave, a camera was hidden in a flower vase to monitor Shoigu's arrival, and the detonator was supposedly controlled via WhatsApp and Signal. The footage was transmitted to foreign handlers, well, probably to Trump or Emmanuel Macron. So who are the perpetrators? The FSB claims that 2 drug-addicted Russians were allegedly involved in the operation, as well as migrants from Central Asia who are wanted for murder, and a man from Kyiv. So, according to the story, the assassination of one of the most heavily guarded people in Russia, someone close to Putin, was entrusted to drug-addicted Russians who can barely stand on their feet. And of course, to a migrant from Central Asia. You all perfectly understand who Russia is fighting against migrants and against Ukraine. Here the bouquet comes together. On November 14th, the FSB published for the first time a video of the bomb being defused and the trio being detained. But at that time, the target was still unclear. Last week, the security services had already announced that they had prevented a large-scale terrorist attack against the authorities, against a high-ranking official. And now it has become clear that they were talking about Shoigu. On that note, the official version ends here, but we both know perfectly well that it's not that simple. So what really happened? Why does all of this look staged? The composition of the group is absolutely not serious. The story about the camera in Asia is honestly on the level of a school play. And the combination of migrants plus Ukraine is a familiar propaganda tactic. But even the date, the anniversary, fits just too perfectly into the emotional script of the Russian security services. Why would the FSB even stage such a performance? There is a purge of the elites underway in Russia. A person who knows too much about Prigozhin's campaign, about the real losses of the army, about corruption in the Ministry of Defense, about his own clan and their money, can't take a single step. When such a system starts to crack, it gets rid of the excess. And now a ready-made informational legend is being created. We warned you there was already an attempt on his life, and the culprits have been identified in advance. They're migrants and Ukraine. This is a staged performance preparing for a real assassination attempt on Shoigu. Only this time it will be real. And it's clear that the perpetrators have already been found, Ukraine and migrants. This isn't about protecting Shoigu, it's about preparing to eliminate him. This is exactly how, for decades, a backstory has been created in Russia before political murders and sudden deaths. Falls from windows, accidents, heart attacks. We've seen all of this before. Do you even remember how many top managers in the energy sector have fallen out of windows? They get thrown out of windows in batches. And right now, the operation doesn't look like a foiled assassination attempt, but rather like a rehearsal for an actual elimination. It's important to recall our investigation by Vladimir Osechkin, who had already said that Shoigu represents a huge clan, billions in corruption, theft, schemes within the Ministry of Defense, and dangerous knowledge about Putin's system. Because, as you remember, when Prigozhin was marching on Moscow, it said that it was Shoigu himself who gave that very order from the command post. If the Kremlin wants to get rid of someone who knows too much, it's exactly this kind of FSB spectacle that will be the first signal. Now you will see an interview with Vladimir Osechkin. It explains in detail what lies behind the Shoigu clan, what corruption schemes he built, and why he could become the next victim of Putin's purge this year.
As our source smirked, he said that not even a calendar year will pass before Shoigu and Prigozhin meet. Within a year, something will also happen to Shoigu himself. In this case, for Lubyanka, for the FSB, which is the most powerful Russian special service and the most influential within Russia, Shoigu is not just a complete nobody, but a disgrace, a thief, and essentially a traitor to the state, because it was at Shoigu's initiative that the Tsalikov-Ivanov team declassified a huge amount of information that should have been protected as state secrets. But in the FSB, Shoigu is despised, so he has no support in the FSO either, nor will he have any in the FSB. And in the Russian army, believe me, as soon as Belousov officially takes office in the coming days, comes in, visits, and gathers everyone, all those who just 2 weeks ago were ready to bend over backwards and curry favor with Shoigu, these same people will be bad-mouthing him. These same people will be writing and are already now writing reports to the Accounts Chamber and the Presidential Control Directorate. To the Military Investigative Committee, the Military Prosecutor's Office, reporting on contractors and subcontractors and on what Tsalikov, Ivanov, and Shoigu forced them to do. So here, for Shoigu, he's an empty shell, a complete zero. And I'll emphasize again, this position was offered to him as a temporary one, precisely to avoid the threat of a military coup or mutiny. Just like, remember, with Prigozhin, he was promised security guarantees. Even the FSB closed the criminal case against him for organizing a military mutiny. But in reality, 2 months later, he was quietly eliminated. So it's quite possible that something similar could happen here with Sergei Shoigu, a man of advanced age, within the next calendar year. But most likely, not a plane crash. He'll probably avoid long trips on business jets, considering the negative experience. Yevgeny Prigozhin. Well, anything can happen. Their palaces have slippery showers, and you never know when a bone might turn up in the soup. So once again, I want to emphasize, you can mark this down. I would be very surprised if Shoigu lives more than a year after his resignation. The Shoigu clan is Sergei Shoigu himself and his family. It includes his first deputy, Ruslan Tsalikov, who was his first deputy both during his time as governor of the Moscow region and while he was in charge of the Ministry of Emergency Situations. In other words, this is someone very close to him, with whom he has been on the same team for more than 25 years. Later, when they came to the Moscow region, they needed a young, enterprising, and resourceful businessman who could skillfully pull chestnuts out of the fire and help them cash in on the Moscow region. They chose Timur Ivanov for this role after getting approval from the FSB. He was an experienced operator with connections to cash-out offices and a large number of shady characters. They practiced on the Moscow region, made quite a lot of money, and obviously lobbied for this trio to be appointed to the Ministry of Defense. While Shoigu and Tsalikov were almost immediately approved for their positions, one becoming the Minister of Defense and the other the first deputy, there were problems with Timur Ivanov. For a long time, he was not allowed to take the post of deputy minister, so he had to settle for heading one of the Ministry of Defense's subsidiaries, Oboron Service, where, by the way, thanks to his talents, he was already able to set up a corruption scheme. And then, starting from 2013 to 2014, they began to skim off the top. And for the past 10 years, they've been siphoning money from the Ministry of Defense. They transferred many, many hundreds of billions of rubles to the accounts of companies and firms under their control. They managed to make in quotation marks, a rather large amount of money. And in the summer of 2021, a major audit by the Accounts Chamber and the Control Department of Putin's administration was completed, which uncovered those very same massive embezzlements and corruption schemes. Then interrogations began, as well as the detention of entrepreneurs, contractors, and subcontractors, because they had more than 800 unfinished projects and construction sites on their books. And of course, they started testifying against Ivanov and Tsalikov. After that, Ivanov was summoned for questioning. The story keeps silent about what happened there, who Ivanov called, and accordingly who Tsalikov and Shoigu called. But it ended with Ivanov leaving the office with wet pants. Again, someone might say that perhaps he just dropped the glass of water that the investigator had kindly offered him. Someone might assume that he soiled himself out of fear. But the fact remains. At that time, Shoigu's team was on the verge of resignation, criminal cases being opened, and arrests. They had to make a determined effort to somehow hold on to their power and authority. But what can the Ministry of Defense do to stay in power? Of course, start a war. And what we know for certain is that throughout the fall and the end of 2021, military intelligence, which was, of course, under the control of Sergei Shoigu and Ruslan Salikov, began supplying Putin and the Kremlin, with various fake reports claiming that supposedly, in the coming months, NATO was planning to land troops in Ukraine, that some secret agreements were being prepared for Ukraine to join NATO through an expedited process, and so on. They started to exacerbate an already obvious situation, and so when I come across comments, both in the Ukrainian segment of YouTube and in the Russian-speaking one, saying, well, Vladimir, why are you exposing these thieves? After all, they were doing such a good job weakening the Russian army. I want to say that I'm not going to agree here with those who try to portray Shoigu, Tsalkov, and Ivanov as just, mere corrupt officials, Ostap Benders of the Russian army. No, these are the people who were at the helm of the Russian army for 10 years before the open phase of the war began. These are the people whose special units invaded under the guise of "they're not there" and various so-called Slavic corps and so on into Ukrainian territory starting from the spring of 2014. These are the people with the blood of a huge number of innocently killed people on their hands. They are war criminals. Another issue is that for now, under Russian national law, the only possibility is to initiate criminal cases and investigations against them regarding financial matters. Putin himself will never give the green light to prosecute his own accomplices for war crimes. This is now the prerogative of Ukraine's national authorities, the International Criminal Court, an international tribunal, which I am sure is not far off, and so on. But nevertheless, the fact remains. We know for certain that this very clan lobbied for the war. They needed the war, because they know that Putin is that kind of St. Petersburg street guy. Despite being a KGB officer, he still lives by certain codes and acts not like an intelligence officer, but more like someone who brings his crew along with him. And according to his code, you don't change horses midstream. When the open phase of military actions began, Shoigu, Salikov, and Ivanov automatically received a mandate for at least 1.5 to 2 years ahead. And at that moment, they avoided dismissals, arrests, detentions, confiscations, and, by the way, continued to profit from the war. The war helped them write off a huge amount of what they had stolen. If you remember, in the first months of the war, Ukrainian experts and military personnel showed a huge number of such empty vehicles, skungins, that entered Ukrainian territory and were destroyed by the heroes of the armed forces of Ukraine with grenade launchers and other weapons. And when they looked inside, it turned out that there was practically no technical equipment inside at all. But according to the Ministry of Defense's documents, these were supposed to be super-duper special vehicles that could jam everything imaginable and help establish the necessary mode of interaction for the Ministry of Defense. They wrote off a huge amount of stolen goods during the war. On top of everything else, Timur Ivanov also set up schemes to embezzle funds during the construction of residential neighborhoods in the occupied territories, bringing in his key contractors, including his current accomplice, Sasha Fomin, and the company Olymp City Stroy, who is sitting with him in neighboring cells, tapping messages to each other and giving testimony, and both of them are involved in the corruption case with bribes totaling more than 1,100,000,000 rubles. That is an enormous amount of money. Accordingly, this created a situation where the corrupt officials were interested in the start of the war. Of course, no one here is going to absolve them of responsibility for the actions of the general staff, for involving this person from the Wagner terrorist organization, for the killing of a huge number of Ukrainians. Let me emphasize again, this is already the prerogative of an international investigation. But what should we do? Of course, we needed to expose them. We needed to stop them by all possible means. And it so happened that at a certain point, while conducting our independent investigation, we discovered that the interests of two different clans in Russia were beginning to clash. Then, of course, we tried to escalate the situation further and took part in discrediting the Wagner PMC, because it truly was an absolutely inhumane organization that killed people with sledgehammers, used the harshest forms of torture, and so on. And at a certain point, Prigozhin, as the overseer of the Wagner PMC from Putin, realized that Ivanov, Tsarikov, and Shoigu were somehow trying to get rid of him, to destroy him, and an open confrontation began between them starting from March or April 2023. The whole world saw what this led to in the most popular media. On June 23rd, 2023, a military mutiny began, with Wagner fighters marching on Moscow. After that, Putin somehow, through Patrushev, Bortnikov, and Lukashenko, managed to persuade them to back down. And then, as we can see in these images, this is already the execution of Yevgeny Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin on August 23rd, 2023, when, on Putin's orders, their Embraer was destroyed in the air and they fell from several thousand meters, crashing to the ground, and were killed. And then, throughout the end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024, Vladimir Putin began to investigate how it happened that his own pet monster, this terrorist organization, the so-called Wagner PMC, of course, it was not a private military company, but rather the Kremlin's army, Putin's army, an army of real cutthroats and war criminals. How did it happen that Putin's own creation suddenly got out of control? And after conducting their own analysis, they realized that in addition to human rights organizations, Ukraine and international bodies that had begun investigating the crimes of the Wagner group, Tsalkov and Ivanov had also openly started to act against Prigozhin and Utkin. Timur Ivanov is a fan of a luxurious lifestyle. He has traveled to various countries around the world multiple times, including trips to Africa. He went hunting, went on safaris wearing a pith helmet. He really liked Africa. And together with Salikov, he set his sights on the assets that Yevgeny Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin had fought for with blood and sweat in Africa. We're talking about diamond mines, gold mines, and sites for extracting oil, gas, and rare earth metals, or places where these valuable resources are found and extracted. And then, accordingly, Timur Ivanov managed to convince Sergei Shoigu to go through with this venture and begin a trader-style takeover of what had been under the control of Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner PMC. And accordingly, Timur Ivanov himself and Yunusbek Yevkurov traveled to a number of African countries and to the sites that had previously generated income for Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Kovalchuks behind him. So after that, they began to move in the so-called Ministry of Defense people. These are businessmen who have long cooperated with Shoigu, Tsalkov, and Ivanov. And accordingly, when this puzzle came together in Putin's mind, and he realized who from the inside had destabilized Prigozhin and created the conditions for some units to start fighting against others, it became clear that all the anger would then fall on Shoigu, Tsalkov, and Ivanov. One of them was demonstratively detained and taken to the Basmany court, where Timur Ivanov, in uniform, in fact, he is a civilian, but his uniform corresponds to the rank of army general. And so a man with a huge star on his shoulder boards was placed in that glass box, publicly humiliated, and handed over for slaughter. As for the fate of Tsalkov and Shoigu, of course, they started to think. And what our source told us several days before the official resignation date was that even before May 9th, certain special units of the FSO and FSB began preparing a special operation at Frunzenskaya embankment in the main building of the Ministry of Defense, because they were seriously concerned that if insider information leaked ahead of time to Sergei Shoigu and Tsalikov, they might very well decide to stage a military coup. After all, these are the leaders of the Russian army, and of course they have a certain circle of loyal colonels, major generals, and lieutenant generals who understand that the dismissal of these officials would also lead to their own dismissal, to their removal from this military Olympus. Therefore, the special operation was further structured in such a way as to first and foremost buy off Sergei Shoigu himself, so that he would abandon any military plans. And he was offered Nikolai Patrushev's position. In this case, Putin accused Patrushev of losing control over the security bloc during the events that took place in June 2023. As the secretary of the Security Council, he was appointed by Putin back in 2008 to oversee the entire security bloc. And his main responsibilities included resolving conflicts and managing clashes of interest among the ministers of defense, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the FSB, and so on. It's clear that the events involving Prigozhin and the Wagner PMC in June 2023 completely destroyed Patrushev's reputation. he stopped being able to fulfill his duties. Therefore, when Putin, together with the FSO and FSB, was working out a special operation on how to neutralize Shoigu's clan and regain control over the Ministry of Defense, a plan was formed to sacrifice a major piece, like a bishop or a rook, to sacrifice Patrushev and send him off to some other honorary ceremonial general's position, and to temporarily offer this prestigious position of Security Council Secretary to Sergei Shoigu, although, as our source smirked, he said that not even a calendar year would pass before Shoigu meets Prigozhin. But it's clear that Yevgeny Prigozhin is not in Argentina or anywhere like that, as the well-known Professor Solovey claims. It's clear that Yevgeny Prigozhin was indeed killed, and the point is that most likely within a year, something will also happen to Shoigu himself. As for the fate of Ruslan Salikov, that's a big question. It's not by chance that we have several times. A week ago, in a joking manner, Ruslan Salikov was offered evacuation and invited to end up in a warm, comfortable, safe and cozy cell in a Hague prison, which is 100% much safer and more comfortable than a cell in Lefortovo, and certainly more so than the harsh prison transfers in Siberia or the Arctic. Well, at that time, Ruslan Salikov didn't listen. He thought their armored train was speeding ahead, that no one could stop them, but now it's clear that he regrets it, though, of course, he won't be allowed to leave Russia anymore. As for what will happen to him in the near future, I think he faces the same fate, a repeat of Timur Ivanov's story. Unless, of course, at some point they're able to buy their way out because they have assets worth billions of dollars and euros. And it's quite possible that, given the resources in Russia are limited, Russia is under sanctions and every billion counts for them. It's quite possible that somehow the Tsar or someone else will buy them an indulgence and a quiet retirement on Nikolino Hill, although probably 90% likely he'll end up behind bars within a month or two, just like Timur Ivanov, who realized his protection was gone, that no one would pull strings or save him. And I think Ivanov, in the near future, will be giving a huge amount of information and testimony to the investigators.
Vladimir, while we have the chance, since you know everything, who is behind Solovyov? Who do you think it is, the FSB or Kemezov?
Oh, listen, first of all, I definitely can't say that I know everything. People who speak with a knowing look, claiming they know everything, usually don't know anything at all. They're just subscribed to our channels and to some channels that actually have some serious sources. As for Valery Solovey, I think he is a very talented MGIMO professor who has taught more than one generation of Russian intelligence officers who went on to serve in the Foreign Intelligence Service, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Rosotrudnichestvo. And what he does with public opinion overall, periodically shocking and throwing out absolute fakes and lies. But at the same time, with a smart look, a calm voice, and so on, he gives all his students very clear examples of how public opinion can be manipulated. He said that Putin had died, that Putin was in a refrigerator, and that some guy named Vasilyevich had taken his place. And a huge number of people just start believing it thoughtlessly because the world and the public are so tired of the dictator Putin that they really want to believe he's dead, even though leaders of other countries meet with him, the Chinese leadership meets with him, and so on. But can you really imagine Xi Jinping meeting with some kind of clown and so on? Well, it's impossible that one of the leaders of the most powerful, most successful, and wealthiest countries in the world, China, for example, would meet with a puppet, with a stand-in. Of course not. It's simply impossible to imagine. And yet somehow in the minds of Mr. Solovyov's audience, all of this makes sense. Putin has corpses in the fridge, even though we can see that he's alive and continues to do evil. By the way, when people say that he's already dead, it actually creates the impression that he's gone, and therefore there's no need to conduct an international investigation against him, no need for public opinion to demand that international bodies quickly set up a tribunal, take action, or at the very least detain him. This immediately demotivates Western intelligence agencies. There's no need to think, for example, about a special operation specifically against the dictator, or it confuses the same GUR and SBU, telling them it's all over already, sort of. But there's already a double, a triple, just relax, there's nothing to be done. Don't consider him a legitimate military target. Supposedly he's in the fridge. At the same time, even though Yevgeny Prigozhin was obviously executed and killed, and of course this was done with Putin's approval, carried out on Putin's orders by Bortnikov's officers, the same thing is immediately thrown out there. No, Yevgeny Prigozhin, that's just a clever trick. In reality, those aren't his remains. He's alive, he's in Argentina, he'll show himself in a month, in 2, in 3. A huge amount of time has already passed. Of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin was buried and his family's assets are being taken away. The Wagner PMC has fallen apart, it has been destroyed. But at that very moment, for the Wagner fighters who were ready to repeat that military mutiny, Valery Solovey convinced them, sleep, he's in Argentina, he'll call you all soon, and you'll meet him in Molkino or Figolkino. Well, in reality, it was just another example of working with public opinion, and a talented one at that. Everything they do, the agenda they're pushing, actually plays into the Kremlin's hands. Putin is supposedly in a refrigerator, calm down, don't do anything against him. And Prigozhin is alive, wait for him, don't take revenge for him. But these are exactly the narratives that were needed. It's quite possible that this is exactly what happened, that Patrushev somehow managed to use this particular story to promote himself and score some points so that he would be respected even more by those around him and people would listen to him. Although in reality, during the military mutiny, he just turned out to be an obvious figurehead general whose only achievement was to calm Prigozhin down through deception, through some shady schemes, even involving Lukashenko in this arrangement.
The husband of Putin's secret niece, the Minister of Energy and head of the accounts chamber, is the son of Kovalchuk, one of Putin's closest friends.
The strengthening of the family, the strengthening of the Kovalchuk clan is underway. Kovalchuk Jr. will be the chief accountant, keeping track of whether budget funds are being spent prudently or wastefully. Those who funnel money out of the Russian Federation's budget with the Kovalchuk clan's approval will be favored, and according to the accounts chamber's reports, everything will look fine for them. Everything will look wonderful and perfect, and all their figures will be presented in such a way that it appears extremely favorable to Putin, the Russian government, and even to the Russian people. But for those who try to bypass the system, who don't play by the rules and instead steal and embezzle, the Kovalchuks will come after them, followed by actions from the Russian Investigative Committee, the FSB, and so on. That's the story with the Kovalchuks. And as for the fact that one of Vladimir Putin's closest relatives is becoming the Minister of Energy and will be in charge of resources, well, once again, it's all about the family. They're doing everything possible so that, thanks to the administrative resources of big business and the security bloc, when the joyful news is announced to everyone and Swan Lake starts playing on TV, the family members will, in any case, be integrated into this system. Of the Russian oligarchy, which privatized Russia more than 20 years ago and has been siphoning off budget funds ever since.